Welcome to the deep dive. We're skipping the usual noise today and going straight to the source, looking at oil, but specifically the business strategy and the battlefield impact.
Exactly. We're talking boardroom maneuvers and, well, actual wars, how oil shaped companies and conflicts.
Yeah, think of it as your essential briefing. We're using Daniel Yergin's The Prize as our main guide here. It's just fantastic at connecting corporate moves with, national power plays.
Jurgen really knows his stuff, both the global politics and the nuts and bolts of the oil business. It's quite the read.
Okay, so here's the mission. We start with the birth of Standard Oil, then look at oil's crucial role in World War I and World War II. And finally, we hit the rise of OPEC and those infamous oil shocks. The goal is to really grasp how oil became this central point for business, for power, for everything.
Let's do it. So where does it all begin? Surprisingly, not with cars, but with lamps. People needed better light. Whale oil was expensive. Other stuff just wasn't great.
Right. Kerosene was the killer app initially. But how did they even get the oil out?
Well, the tech was actually borrowed. Drilling techniques used for centuries to get salt, first in China, then in the U.S., they kind of adapted that.
Huh. So one industry's tool becomes another's key.
Pretty much. And then you had George Bissell. He sees this ad randomly for rock oil as medicine, but the ad has drilling derricks on it.
And the light bulb goes off.
Exactly. If you can drill for that, why not drill for oil itself? Seems obvious now, but it was a leap.
That leap leads to Edwin Drake, right, in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, Titusville, Bissell's Seneca Oil Company hires Drake. And Drake, well, he faced a lot of skepticism. People called him crazy, funding was shaky, drillers were unreliable.
Sounds like a rough start.
It was, but he kept at it. And in 1859, bam, the first successful commercial oil well. That really kicked things off.
Kick off an understatement, maybe. The boomtowns sound wild. Pithole Creek.
Oh, Pithole Creek is the perfect example. Exploded out of nowhere, intense speculation, land prices going through the roof, banks, telegraphs, hotels popping up like mushrooms.
Along with less reputable establishments, I gather?
Definitely that, too. It was chaotic. Huge production, but no real organization, just frenzy. And that kind of instability, that chaos, it created an opening.
An opening for someone like John D. Rockefeller.
Precisely. Rockefeller was different, very pious, incredibly focused, obsessed with details, with numbers, even as a kid selling turkeys, apparently.
And his father pushed mercantile skills, didn't he?
He did, in his own unique way. But Rockefeller saw the early refining business. Too many players, terrible quality control, everyone losing money, and saw waste. He hated waste.
So consolidation was the answer. Bring order to the chaos.
That was the driving idea, which led to the Standard Oil Company in 1870, him, Henry Flagler, a few others.
And the name Standard was deliberate, wasn't it?
Absolutely. It was a promise. Standard quality kerosene, something consumers could actually rely on, which was a big deal back then.
And they started small, relatively speaking.
Yeah, maybe controlled a tenth of the refining industry at first, but they grew fast.
What was their edge early on?
Management, partly. Rockefeller brought in his former competitors, strong personalities, mind you, but fostered this culture of intense debate followed by a unanimous agreement. Allowed them to move decisively.
Okay, so unified action despite the egos.
Right. And they were aggressive in expanding, constantly tackling problems.
And the product itself, kerosene, it changed things.
Hugely. Especially in rural areas. It literally extended the usable hours of the day. People got it from grocers, druggists, supplied by wholesalers, increasingly linked to Standard.
But this American dominance couldn't last, right? The world is big.
Nope. Competition was brewing.
Yeah.
Big time. Yeah, the Rothschilds investing heavily in Russian oil fields around Baku. They formed Benito.
And built a crucial railway.
The Baku-Batun Railroad. Yeah. That opened up Western markets for Russian oil. Suddenly, Standard had a real fight on its hands, a fight that lasted decades.
Did Standard see it coming?
Initially. They seemed a bit complacent. Intelligence started filtering back to headquarters, 26 Broadway, about these guys. They even tried to buy a big chunk of Ludwig Nobel's operation in Russia.
But Nobel said no.
He wasn't interested. Didn't want to be swallowed up.
Then along comes Marcus Samuel.
Ah, yes. A different kind of challenge. Samuel had this idea. Purpose-built tankers to take Russian oil through the Suez Canal, directly challenging Standard in Asia.
That sounds risky. Weren't there safety concerns? Established players pushing back?
Definitely. But he had backing the Rothschilds again, bankworms. And crucially, the British government saw strategic value in it.
So Samuel's company, later Shell, starts building its own network.
Exactly. Storage tanks, distribution all across Asia, using the Abrahams brothers as their, boots on the ground.
Standard's response.
Price wars, predictably. Cutthroat competition. But they also realized, okay, we need our own crude closer to these markets.
Which led them to?
Sumatra, the Dutch East Indies, where Royal Dutch, under Kessler, was already having success with its Crown Oil.
Another major competitor emerging, Royal Dutch.
Yep. They had their own financial struggles early on, but they were sitting on a lot of oil. Standard was watching them closely.
And then the real game changer arrives, the automobile.
Oh, absolutely. Suddenly gasoline, which was practically a nuisance byproduct before, becomes incredibly valuable. Car registrations just skyrocket.
And people start using fuel oil more in industry too.
Right, so demand is exploding. And a new worry creeps in. Are the existing fields, Pennsylvania, Lima, Ohio, are they enough? Where's the future supply?
This must have weakened Standard's grip a bit.
It did. The sheer demand created space for independent producers and refiners. Guys like the Producers and Refiners Oil Company started building their own pipelines, even with Standard likely trying to block them.
And then Texas? Spindletop.
January 1901.
Yeah.
A monster gusher. Initially, it was too successful, flooded the market, prices crashed.
The company behind it got into trouble.
Guffey Petroleum,
Yeah.
Financial difficulties, which brought in the Pittsburgh bankers, Andrew and Richard Mellon.
The Mellons, they tried to sell it to...
They did, but Standard Oil said no. They were already fighting antitrust battles in Texas. Rockefeller was persona non grata there.
So turning it down basically created another huge rival.
Pretty much. The Mellons took it over themselves, formed Gulf Refining Company. Another giant is born thanks partly to Standard's legal woes.
And those legal woes were ramping up elsewhere too, right? Anti-monopoly fever?
Oh, yeah. States were going after them left and right. Standard, maybe a bit arrogantly, seemed to underestimate the opposition for a while.
Internally, things were shifting too. John Archbold became more powerful.
Very much so. He was the guy secretly buying up refineries, working his way up. Apparently even agreed to Rockefeller's temperance pledge, which is interesting.
While Rockefeller himself was moving more towards philanthropy.
Yeah, stepping back from day to day, but still deeply connected. And Standard was just printing money by this point. Huge dividends. A bank within an industry, Jurgen calls it.
And this is when Ida Tarbell enters the scene.
Right, pioneering female journalist. Her father had been hurt by Standard's tactics. She decides to investigate the mother of trusts.
How did she get access?
Remarkably, through H.H. Rogers, a top Standard director. He was an associate of Mark Twain, quite a character himself. Maybe he underestimated her or thought he could manage the story.
Big mistake.
Huge. Her articles were meticulous, damning, really fueled the fire. Then Teddy Roosevelt's administration launches its own investigation.
And Standard's attempts to lobby Roosevelt failed.
Completely. The tide had turned. The government was serious this time.
Meanwhile, Standard almost bought Royal Dutch.
Yeah, another near miss. They made a serious offer, but Marcus Samuel, Shell's founder, refused. Partly patriotism, partly not wanting to lose control.
And that refusal led to Royal Dutch merging with Shell.
Exactly, under Henri de Terting's leadership, creating the giant Royal Dutch Shell, a true global competitor to Standard Oil.
While all this is happening, Russian oil is declining.
Yeah, before World War I, stagnation, lack of investment in tech, their global export share plummeted. Kind of sad given their early dominance.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly. Persia, Iran. Why was that becoming important?
Strategic location. A buffer between Russia and British India, and potentially oil. Britain and Russia were vying for influence, concessions.
Enter William Knox Darcy.
Gets a concession, spends years drilling, finds nothing, runs out of money.
But Burma Oil steps in.
They do. And it's partly because the British Admiralty, the Navy, is getting very interested in securing oil supplies. They see the future.
And they finally strike oil, just in time.
Unbelievably. George Reynolds, the geologist, hits a gusher, literally as Burma Oil is sending the telegram telling him to stop drilling and come home.
Right.
Amazing timing.
Which brings us to Winston Churchill.
Yes. He becomes First Lord of the Admiralty. He sees Germany rising, sees the future of naval warfare, especially after the Agadir crisis in 1911.
And he's convinced the Navy needs to switch from coal to oil.
Absolutely. Faster ships, longer range, less refueling. Big advantages. But there were huge challenges. Where do you reliably get all that oil? Prices were going up.
So he pushed for diversifying supply, not relying on one company.
Exactly. His big memo laid it out. Secure diverse sources, don't be held hostage by a monopoly, strategic thinking.
And then World War I breaks out. Oil's role changes dramatically.
Utterly. It becomes the war of the internal combustion engine. Trucks, tanks, airplanes. mobility that was impossible before,
Yeah.
not just navies anymore. But this new demand created problems, didn't it? For Britain especially.
Oh, yeah. By 1916, they were facing a serious dearth of petrol. German U-boats were sinking tankers. Demand from the Western Front was just soaring.
It's a crisis point.
Definitely. And Churchill, seeing this, pushes for the government to secure its own supply.
Which leads to
The British government buying a controlling stake in Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the company that found the oil Darcy was looking for, a massive strategic investment, later becomes BP.
wow. Government becoming an oil major. Okay, fast forward. World War II. Oil is even more critical now, isn't it?
Absolutely central. Look at Germany, limited natural oil, so they pour resources into synthetic fuel.
Lena Bemsen. Hugely expensive, energy intensive.
And horrifically reliant on forced labor from concentration camps like Auschwitz, used by I.G. Farben.
A dark chapter.
A very dark chapter. And Japan, their whole push into Southeast Asia.
Driven by oil. The U.S. embargoes, cutting off their supply, basically forced their hand from their perspective. Pearl Harbor was in large part about securing the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies.
And they got them, initially. Swept through Southeast Asia in early 42.
But it wasn't enough in the long run.
No. As the war went on, Allied submarines, bombing raids, Japan faced crippling oil shortages. It impacted everything, midway, their ability to fight effectively.
And for the Allies.
Oil was the lifeblood. The U.S. especially became the arsenal of democracy and the oil supplier. Harold Akes becomes the petroleum czar, coordinating everything, facing industry distrust but getting it done. Rationing kicks in for civilians.
It really was a war of engines and octanes, as Jurgen puts it. Totally. And things like 100-octane aviation gasoline. That gave Allied planes a crucial performance edge, especially early on, like in the Battle of Britain. Shell initially hesitated, but production ramped up.
And the Middle East's importance just keeps growing.
Exponentially. Even during the war, the U.S. and Britain are propping up Saudi Arabia financially. They see it's vital for the future. The sheer scale of Allied consumption makes everyone realize, wow, we might actually run short.
Which leads to post-war maneuvering.
Big time. U.S. companies like Jersey, Exxon, and Soconi, Mobil, want into Saudi Arabia, into Aramco, which was initially just SoCal and Texaco.
But there were obstacles. The Red Line Agreement.
Yes, this old agreement covering the former Ottoman Empire involving the Iraq Petroleum Company partners. Getting waivers meant dealing with the legendary Calouste Gulbenkian Mr. 5%.
Sounds complicated.
Well, it was. Gulbenkian drove a hard bargain, plus U.S. antitrust concerns. But eventually they got in. Aramco became this powerhouse consortium.
And the relationship with Saudi Arabia evolves too.
Ibn Saud was balancing oil interests with rising Arab nationalism, the new issue of Israel, a complex dance. But the core reality was the West, particularly the U.S., needed that oil for the Cold War, for economic recovery.
And the deals started changing, the 50-50 principle.
Yes, started in Venezuela, spread to the Middle East. Governments demanded a 50% share of the profits, not just royalties. Suddenly, producing countries had serious money. Saudi Arabia realized Aramco was paying more tax to the U.S. than royalties to them. That didn't sit right.
Which fuels nationalism, figures like Mossadegh in Iran.
Exactly. Mossadegh, a fierce nationalist, challenges the British Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Leads to nationalization in '51.
Which triggers a crisis, eventually involving the CIA, a whole other story. But it shows the rising tension.
Absolutely. Then comes the Suez Crisis in '56. Nasser nationalizes the canal. Britain and France invade.
But the U.S. under Eisenhower opposes them.
Strongly. And crucially, Eisenhower uses oil as leverage. He restricts supplies to Britain and France, forcing them to back down. A major turning point.
Consequences of Suez.
Huge. Rise of the supertanker, because the Cape route became more viable. British influence plummets. Nasser becomes a hero in the Arab world. U.S. power is cemented. And maybe, just maybe, if Britain had known about North Sea oil then, history might be different.
Interesting thought. And new players keep emerging, like Italy's AGIP.
Under Enrico Mattei, yeah. Bold, unconventional, challenging the majors.
And the producing countries themselves start organizing.
Yes, Venezuela's Perez Alfonso, Saudi Arabia's Abdullah Tariki. Key figures who saw the companies cutting prices without consultation. This leads directly to the formation of OPEC in Baghdad in 1960.
OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, designed to give producers more power.
Exactly. To coordinate policy, push back against the Seven Sisters, the big international oil company.
And other factors are shifting the balance too, like Libyan oil.
Yeah, Libya suddenly becomes a massive producer in the 60s. Lots of independent companies rushed in there, often using, shall we say, incentives or bakshish.
Like Occidental under Armand Hammer.
He was legendary for his methods. But all this new Libyan oil hits the market. Independents are cutting prices aggressively in Europe to gain share.
So prices are dropping again. It's still a buyer's market.
For a while, yes. But things were changing beneath the surface. Demand kept rising relentlessly. U.S. domestic production started peaking, partly because prorationing made imports attractive. Europe had switched massively from coal to cheap Middle Eastern oil.
So the surplus was disappearing.
Exactly. By the late 60s, early 70s, the cushion was gone. The market was tightening.
Eisenhower had tried voluntary import quotas in the U.S., but they didn't really work.
No, they eventually became mandatory, but the underlying demand pressure was immense.
And then the 1967 Arab-Israeli War happens, another embargo.
A brief one. But it didn't bite that hard. There were still high stock levels. Other producers like the U.S., Venezuela, Iran ramped up output. It was disruptive, but not catastrophic.
But it probably focused minds. And Saudi Arabia and Iran become even more central.
Definitely. Especially with Britain withdrawing from east of Suez. Nixon saw the Shah of Iran as a key pillar, a regional policeman armed by the U.S.
So the stage is set for the 1970s, the surplus is gone, dependence on the Middle East is high.
And then Prudhoe Bay is discovered in Alaska. Huge field, a brief moment of optimism. Maybe this solves U.S. import needs. But development takes time, environmental hurdles.
And then Gaddafi takes power in Libya, 1969.
Yeah, the coup changes everything there. Gaddafi starts squeezing the oil companies, demanding better terms, cutting production. He targets the independents first, like Occidental, who are most vulnerable.
Doing pressure on prices.
Big time. OPEC sees this success and gets bolder. They start demanding collective negotiations, higher prices, more control. The Tehran and Tripoli agreements in '71 basically signal a major shift. The companies have to concede.
And the U.S. is becoming more dependent. Nixon lifts import quotas.
Yep, in April 1973. Domestic production just couldn't keep up with demand anymore. The U.S. was importing more and more.
Then comes October 1973, the Yom Kippur War.
A surprise attack by Egypt and Syria on Israel. Major intelligence failures on both Israeli and U.S. sides.
Israel struggles initially. U.S. starts a massive airlift.
Soviets resupply the Arab states, tensions skyrocket, and then the Arab members of OPEC unleash the oil weapon.
The 1973 oil embargo.
Targeted primarily at the U.S. and the Netherlands for supporting Israel, but coupled with production cuts across OPEC.
Panic ensues.
Absolutely. Gas lines, rationing, economic fear. The oil companies try to allocate the shortages based on equal misery, but it's chaos.
And then OPEC meets in Tehran in December '73.
And they drop the bombshell. They unilaterally quadruple the posted price of oil from where it was before the war started.
Yeah.
A massive earth-shattering price hike.
The first oil shock.
The end of cheap oil. Power had decisively shifted. Consuming nations were reeling. Japan, highly dependent, shifted its foreign policy towards the Arab world overnight.
Kissinger tries to organize the consuming nations.
Yeah, convened an energy conference, tried to create a united front, heal the rifts in the Western alliance. Britain was hit especially hard, with coal miner strikes compounded the energy crisis.
Was OPEC united on these huge price hikes?
Not entirely. Saudi Arabia, guided by Sheikh Yamani, generally favored more moderate increases. They worried about destroying Western economies or encouraging alternatives too quickly, but more radical voices, like Libya, often pushed for more.
What was the U.S. strategy then?
Under Nixon, Ford, Carter, basically oppose the aggressive price hikes, but also be wary of trying to force prices down too much, a fear of destabilizing friendly regimes like Saudi Arabia. There was even talk of a minimum safeguard price to encourage investment in alternatives.
And the producing countries consolidate control.
Completely. Kuwait takes full control from Gulf and BP. Saudi Arabia gradually increases its stake in Aramco until it reaches 100% ownership. The old concession system was dead.
So the end of cheap oil, a profound shift. Did it mean the end of hydrocarbon men, as some wondered? Limits to growth?
It certainly raised those questions. Economic growth, social stability, they seemed much more fragile. Consuming nations felt their sovereignty, their security was diminished.
And ironically, the oil companies, once so powerful in the producing countries,
now found themselves facing scrutiny, antitrust investigations, and higher taxes back home in the consuming countries. The tables had truly turned.
It's an incredible story of power, money, conflict, technology, all swirling around this one resource.
Absolutely. And it leaves you wondering.
Yeah. Given this tumultuous history, all the unexpected twists, what's the next chapter going to look like? What new forces, new technologies, new political shifts could reshape this whole energy landscape again?
That's the big question, isn't it? Definitely something to keep thinking about.